Welcome to Commander Central, episode 329, and today we'll be taking a look at a listener Andy Fleury's Noyan Roil Shaper deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, how's it going today?
It is going well. Happy Saturday morning to you.
Thank you. We had a bit of a scheduling snafu yesterday, so it's Max and I this morning recording without Chris, and I think Chris and I are going to do another deck tech that'll come out on Thursday, and we're going to record that without Max this week, so the three of us we're getting stuff done even when scheduling stuff pops up.
Right.
How you doing?
You know what? I'm doing good. I had a low-key Friday night, so I'm ready to go this morning.
Nice.
I have an interesting bit of fact for you, Dana.
Oh, drop it on me. What do you got here?
Today marks our 5-year anniversary of the show.
Oh, that's right. You told me that the other day that you were, for some reason I thought it was like 6 years, but yeah, you mentioned the other day that it was the 5-year anniversary. That was very cool.
Episode 1 came out August 13th, 2017.
That is nuts.
Yeah, so thank you everybody who's been on this journey with us.
Yeah, that's 5 whole years. That's insane.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I got, for no real reason, so I have two tattoos on my forearms, one for each podcast, one for breaking 100 episodes with Commander Central, and one for breaking 100 with DDH Recast. But I was like, okay, I got those. I wanted to get another magic tattoo, so I went in on Monday and got the Dimir guild symbol on my forearm. So now I have my third magic tattoo. And now, of course, I'm like, well, now it's off balance. I have 2 on one forearm and 1 on the other. So I need to figure out what I'm going to get for a 4th one now. But the Dimir logo is healing up nicely. It's the scabbed over an itchy portion of the recovery process, but it looks real good.
Yeah, I've seen it in person. It looks really great. Can't wait to see when it's finally all healed up.
So, because you have an Azorius guild symbol in addition to your Commander Central logo.
I do.
So have you thought about getting anything else, or are you sticking with what you've got there? Or at least in terms of magic tattoos. I know you have like a couple hockey tattoos and stuff, but...
For magic tattoos, I'm good right now. My next ones are probably going to be all video game related.
Nice. Anything in mind? Yeah, the PlayStation logo you're talking about doing, weren't you?
I'm thinking about doing the cross, square, triangle, and circle on my left wrist.
Nice. Very cool. Okay, so welcome back to Tattoo Chat with Dana and Max. So not that either of us are like exactly experts, but yeah, it's once you get one, it's tough to just stay there. It's like a Pringle.
It's like magic cards. Once you open a pack, you need more.
It's like EDH decks. You can't build just one.
And they about cost the same.
You are not. I mean, my EDH decks are more expensive than my tattoos, but neither of them are definitely cheap. That is 100% for sure. So we're there's nothing in terms of news this week. I think you got your Street Fighter Secret Lair.
I do, yep.
So, which was, announced a while ago. I had one that shipped, I got a ship announcement on one that I purchased. I don't remember which one it even was. I think it's probably the one that had the Mystic Remora foil in it.
Yeah, probably.
I'm guessing, so that I get the ship announcement for that. That'll be here maybe even today. But other than that, like we're waiting until this Thursday is when we get the next batch of Dominaria announcements. The only thing that really has came out, and it's not even like news, is we started to get the stories from Dominaria United. Did you happen to read any of those, Max?
I read the one that released, I think, yesterday about the Raven Man.
Oh, neat. I did not. I read the one on Wednesday. I read the first one, which was the Karn story.
Yep.
And didn't get any further. I didn't get a chance to read any further than that. Yeah, so I will read the next 2 for sure, but I just haven't had a chance to.
I didn't read parts 1 or 2. I mainly caught this one because it was kind of blowing up on my Twitter, and everybody was talking about the Raven Man, and I'm like, oh, I remember us talking about that.
Years ago.
Ixalan, so let's read that one. So
cool.
It was a good read.
Yeah, I am. There's something about Dominaria that just like sucks me in every time, and I can't resist. I read the stories about half the time, but definitely I'm going to go through these couple this weekend to get caught back up because there's just so much about Dominaria that I like. And I'm looking forward to that. I will definitely to read those. And so I enjoyed the first one. Even if you're somebody that's not super into the storyline, I would check them out. Dominaria is just such a great plane. And getting that, your fix, I think, is worth it.
For sure.
All right. Well, you didn't play any games this week, Max, so we don't have any games we played stories, really. I played a couple, but they weren't terribly eventful. We will give a shout-out to our buddy Dr. Mike here quick. We've been playing Magic with him for a couple years, almost every week. He's a really good guy. We talked about him a few weeks back when we were talking about playing with new players, because he's just like the nicest guy to play with. And we're going to give him a shout-out because he's moving. He's not going to be able to play at our shop very often. He might come back, every couple months when he's available, but he's moving a couple hours away. So, Dr. Mike, it's been great playing with you. We know you listen to the show. You're just a good person in general, and thanks a lot for all the good memories, bud.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Mike.
And, we'll do one more since we're shouting out friends of the podcast. Friend of the podcast, Cable Beck, just welcomed his first child, Ren, into the world as well. So we have Dr. Mike leaving, but Cable's bringing a baby into the world. So congrats to Cable and his wife, Ashley, as well. Okay, so basic stuff out of the way, we might as well jump into talking about Andy's deck.
Let's do it.
So I got to play against this deck at Indianapolis, Magic Fest Indianapolis, Command Fest Indianapolis, month or so back. So I've got to actually play against this deck in person, which is always nice, and got to have dinner and sit right by Andy and spend a good bit of time with him and his husband. So Andy's just generally a pretty cool person, and I'm glad we get to talk about his deck. So the first thing here we always ask is, what is your meta like? And Andy says, we've got a diverse meta, but a lot of people who make new decks, and I play with people who generally have a lot of disposable income, so they're generally playing toon decks and likely on the higher power end of the spectrum. And then we ask, what is the goal of the deck? And the goal of the deck is to win through combat with animated lands. He plays board wipes that destroy all non-land permanents to stay ahead.
We also ask, what are the weaknesses or areas that we should focus on? Andy said the deck weakness is that it plays like a control deck, which sometimes makes you the target early. Totally understand that. Also, losing your lands to board wipes is rough, so I usually go tall and not wide by continually pumping a single land over animating several lands all through the course of the game. For a budget limit, no budget, suggest anything we like. Well, okay, that's dangerous. So yeah, we're looking forward to this, and if you don't know who Andy is, he's one of the hosts of the Guardian Project podcast.
Yes. So, I think we've both done guest things with them, yes. either streaming or guested. So it's a good show. Check them out if you get a chance.
Yes.
Okay, so let's jump into this. For those that don't remember Noyan, because this was back in the second Zendikar block, I believe.
Battle for Zendikar?
Battle for Zendikar, yeah. Noyan is 3 and white and blue, 5 total for a 4/4 Merfolk ally. And Noyan reads, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may put 3+1 counters on target land you control. If you do, that land becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with haste that's still a land. So, just like said in the description, you're going to use that Noyan ability to probably go tall, particularly in this case, make a big beater land and smack somebody in the face with it. Kind of an odd thing in Azorius colors, but that makes it interesting too. It's not something you traditionally see in Azorius.
Right. Super odd, because the +1/+1 counter thing really isn't an Azorius thing, nor is landfall or lands in general. I
don't know if I've ever even played outside of Andy's deck against a Noyan deck.
I feel like someone in our shop had one when it came out.
Years ago, maybe?
Yeah. And I haven't seen it since. But yeah, I think Andy is, when I think about this, I just instantly go to Andy.
Yeah, exactly. This is a pretty tuned deck as well. So I think we had this discussion off air before we got here. I'm not sure how many great suggestions we're going to have necessarily, because I think he's been tweaking this for years and years. It's pretty tight. So we have a few suggested tweaks, but this is also an element of show and tell to this versus breaking it down and trying to make changes and make repairs. So first thing we'll do here is look at the land base. There's 36 lands, although technically there's 39 if you want to count the MDFCs. So he should be missing land drops. MDFCs, in my opinion, get really tricky if you're running 35 lands and you have 3 or 4 MDFCs, and then that's when you have to be really disciplined. Be like, okay, I have to make sure I'm willing to take that tempo hit to play this MDFC as a land on turn 4 and not try to hold out and hope that, I can draw one and still use the MDFC as a spell. In Andy's case, he's running 36 lands in addition to the couple MDFCs. That's, I think, the way you want to do it. Ideally, if you're going to have 3 or 4 of those dual face lands, you want to be running them in addition kind of to the lands you run versus instead of.
Yeah, I think Andy takes the mentality I do when using MDFCs. I plan to use them as the spell, and the land is the worst case scenario.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can get away with doing it the inverse if you've got one. Like, you're like, this is my mono green deck, and I'm going to play
Balaged Recovery.
And I'm just going to have some discipline if I draw it in my first 4 turns and I need to make a land drop. It's just going to be my land. But you can get away with it then, I think. But I 100% agree. You got to be really cautious about treating them as lands, particularly if you're someone who plays with a greedy playstyle. So land base here, we have an Arctic Waste, which is the pain land. Something we're going to see quite a bit here are lands that can be turned into creatures. So in this case, you're additionally giving them a buff, because a lot of times these creatures turn into a 2/2 creature, 3/3 creature, whatever. So the counters then buff it beyond what it already was. So like Blink Buff Nexus is one of them. Cascading Cataracts, a land that turns into a creature. Cave of the Frost Dragon, Celestial Colonnade, all lands turn into creatures. Cascading Cataracts is not, but it's indestructible is why that's in here. Command Tower, makes both your colors. Dark Citadel is indestructible, so when you make it into a creature, it's indestructible. Deserted Beach is just a dual land. Drowned Yard Temple, it's a land that if somebody blows it up, you can bring it back from your graveyard. There's a couple of the channel lands from the new Kamigawa set. Aigajo, Seat of the Empire. Fairy Conclave, again, a land that can turn into a creature. Flagstones of Trorcair, a land that if somebody blows it up when it's a creature, lets you search your library for a plains card and put it onto the battlefield. Forbidding Watchtower, a land that turns into a creature. Dual land in the case of Glacial Fortress. Forbidding Watchtower, a land that turns into a creature. Hall of Storm Giants, similarly turns into a creature. The Shock Land in Hallowed Fountain, Moth Nexus, creature land. There's 8 islands, a Mystic Gate, and in Atawara, the Soaring City, which is one of the channel lands. You have 5 plains, a Razor Tide Bridge, which is also indestructible, and a dual land. Reliquary Tower, just to keep all those cards in your hand if you want to. Great dual land in Sea of Clouds, and a Tundra. I mean, there's not much to say about that land base. You've got all the duals you want. You've got the man lands that you can put counters on to make an even more efficient use of Noyan Dar. The only thing I would say is, we say this whenever we look at a deck, it's nice to have 1 or 2 lands that destroy other lands. Whether it's a strip mine or a wasteland, if you have those, if you don't, Ghost Quarter and Tectonic Edge are, 95% just as good.
I mean, Tech Edge wins games. You said it.
It literally does. So I would recommend 1 or 2 of those in almost every deck, just because that's how you don't lose to someone's Cabal Coffers or someone's Nykthos, or worse if there's a guy's Cradle out. So those are the ones that jump out at me. In terms of mana fixing and strategy, that makes sense. Is there anything for you, Max?
The only thing I could think of is, even though Andy's going tall with this deck versus, animating multiple lands, something like a Karn's Bastion might be worthwhile. It's a mana sink to add that additional counter onto a land that could be the extra point of damage you need to eliminate someone.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of downside to it.
Comes in untapped, it taps for mana.
It's a 2-color deck. You can afford to have some utility lands in there. The only other one I thought about, because this is a card I've been running in my decks a bit, is Bonder's Enclave, land that taps and draws you a card if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. In this case, you're pretty frequently going to be doing it with your lands, and your commander definitely does. He qualifies as well. Again, it's just a nice mana sink to get a draw without much downside. You don't use it all the time, but it almost never hurts, and there's enough situations where in the couple decks where I run it, it's that, turn 8 and you're like, I'm going to hold this counter spell up and I'm going to hold this mana back in case because I'm in a good position, and you pass a turn and it comes back around to you and you haven't needed to use your stuff, and you're like, I'm just going to sink that mana into this card draw. There's just not much downside to it. It's really easy to hit creature power 4 or greater in a lot of decks. Just one to throw out there, particularly in a 1 or 2 color deck. There's just not a lot of downside again to use some utility lands, but I don't think it's a huge deal.
Right.
Artifacts. What do we have here for artifacts, Max?
There are 9 artifacts: Arcane Signet, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, Midnight Clock, Mind Stone, Soul Ring, Talisman of Progress, the Ozolith, and Thought Vessel. So
it's all ramp aside from the Ozolith, basically.
Which you kind of need in Azorius, so I support this artifact suite.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Again, this isn't a huge deal. Arcane Signet is just a better Talisman of Progress, unless you happen to need the ability to make colorless mana, like if you're playing something that has those, Eldrazi spells, and there's none in this deck. So in this case, it's just Arcane Signet is just better than Talisman of Progress. Not a big deal, but you're going to take a little bit less damage off it. It's just something I thought I would at least mention.
Yeah. My suggestion, and before I go into this, Andy also provided a primer about what
Yes.
he's done in the deck before, so I double-checked that, didn't see this in there, but Darksteel Garrison. This is from Future Sight. It's a 2-mana artifact, and it says Fortified Land has Indestructible, and whenever Fortified Land becomes tapped, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and you can fortify the land for 3, so it's sort of like an equip cost, but not quite equipped. Even though he's going tall, that land can tap to attack, and then you buff itself.
Right.
And if someone's gonna, choose to remove this over the land that's swinging at him for 10, let him do it.
Yeah, this was one I hemmed and hawed about, if for no other reason that it's some serious style points.
Yeah.
There's just no decks that want a Darksteel Garrison. It's not really, aside from maybe this one. Most people don't even know it exists. The Future Sight one does look super cool in that frame, too. It's definitely like a style point thing as well as not being bad. I'm not sure if it's good enough, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's also not, it's also useful. It's just a question of whether or not there's more useful things to run.
Right.
So, yeah, I was torn on that one, but that would be a super cool include. Other than that, I got nothing really. The only one I was a little bit torn about is Mana Vault, because I don't know if the deck is that fast necessarily, and Mana Vault is basically a dark ritual, because it's unless you have tricks to untap it or do something with that, which this deck doesn't really have. So I don't know. I was wondering if you'd just be better off instead of replacing the Talisman with an Arcane Signet, you'd just be better off replacing Mana Vault with an Arcane Signet. Not that it's bad again, I don't think it is, but I think, at least speaking for myself, I would prefer to have a 2-mana rock that I can consistently every single turn tap for 1 mana than a 1-mana rock that taps for 3 one time and I have to lose mana to get a second use out of it. Mana Vault's great in a super aggro deck. I don't know if this is that deck, so I'm honestly wondering if you wouldn't be better off just with a consistent mana source, but I think I'd have to play the deck to get a feel for that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I don't know why. I kind of agree with you. Maybe this is also just like his pimped out deck, and he has a
Mana
Vault,
for sure,
a foil Mana Vault. It looks like almost.
Yeah.
So I
totally get it. Let's jump down here and take a look at enchantments, I guess, quick. There's a bunch of fun enchantments in here. Equinox from way back in Legends. It's a single white mana for an aura that enchants a land. Tap land enchanted with Equinox to counter a spell that destroys 1 or more of your lands. So basically let your land counterspell anything that's going to destroy your land.
Yeah.
Another one of those cards. I think this feels a little bit like Darksteel Garrison. I don't know if it's that good. You have to leave a land free, and all you're doing is stopping someone from destroying one of your lands, which there's not a lot of things that do that. But it's awesome. I mean, like, man, that probably feels good to have that and stop somebody with it. So it's good. Again, I'm sure it's a perfectly useful spell, particularly in this deck, but I also wonder if you would be better off with a counter spell in general that solves all kinds of problems. But it's fantastic. It's super cool, and I'm just glad to see it in a deck.
Yeah, I really like this card, especially because you could use it to like save the land it's enchanting,
Yes, right, exactly.
But I think it's cool. I think it's perfect for the deck, so it's really cool to see.
Exactly, yeah. There's Overburden, 1 in a blue. I'm making sure the Oracle text here. Whenever a player puts a non-token creature on the battlefield, that player returns a land they control to its owner's hand. So non-token. So it's kind of a stacks piece here a little bit. Like, it's not going to affect Andy very often because he only has 10 creatures in the deck. It says non-token, so his couple things that make tokens aren't going to be affected by it. It's just going to be a thing that really doesn't affect him at all and will affect other people. Heuristic Study, obviously just a great draw. Sacred Ground, another oddball one that you're never going to see outside of maybe a deck like this. Whenever a spell or ability an opponent controls causes a land to be put into your graveyard from play, return that land to play. Just a way to recur the things that people blow up of yours. Terra Eternal, 2 and a white, all lands are indestructible. That includes your opponent's lands, but still, probably much more useful for you than other people.
See, I was torn on this, but I feel like it's kind of how we talk about like Concordant Crossroads.
Yeah.
Green, you don't play it on turn 1, you play it when you're going to Alpha Strike and kill someone.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm going to drop it when it matters most. And also, he doesn't have many things that are blowing up other people's lands anyway. So yeah, it's also, you're much less likely to get burned by this than say Concordant Crossroads or Door of Destinies or something. The last one here is Trade Routes, 1 in a blue. It's an enchantment with 2 activated abilities, both with which cost a colorless mana. So for a colorless, you can return target land you control to its owner's hand, so you can bounce a land, and you can also discard a land card from your hand to draw a card. So there's things in here that recur that we'll talk about that do recur lands from the graveyard, so you can, like, pitch a land to draw a card and then recur it with something else. You can return target land to its owner's hand and put those counters onto the Ozolith, because the Ozolith will leave the battlefield trigger, play the land again, and then move the counters over to a different creature that you wanted to for some reason. So there's a lot of little useful things you could do with Trade Routes. Anything you wanted to add here, Max?
This is the one category I couldn't think of anything to really add. I think they're very niche. All the cards here are very niche for this commander and this type of deck, and I don't really want to mess with it.
So I had 2 small suggestions. The first was Resourceful Defense, 2 and a white. Whenever a permanent you control leaves a battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on target permanent you control. And you can also, for 4 and a white, move any number of counters from a permanent you control to another permanent you control. But mainly, it's going to be a backup to the Ozolith. Do you need a backup to the Ozolith? I don't know. I actually don't think this deck maybe does, but I wanted to mention it as a possibility anyway. The one I do think is useful here, particularly because this is a deck that's going wide and you're trying to kill people with these lands, a deck that is not going wide and you're trying to kill people with these lands that are going tall, is Duelist Heritage, which is an enchantment that during combat you can give a creature double strike. So basically you're letting that 6/6 land or 9/9 land deal 12 or 18 damage. You're just dealing twice as much with thanks to double strike. Even if they have a blocker or something in the way, well then you have your land's less likely to get killed because your thing has first strike at the very least. And it's a really good political toy, or even just a trick when someone's going to hit somebody else, before combat. You can throw the double strike on someone else's creature on their turn. So it's a super useful card in a lot of contexts, but I think this is a deck where, since you're trying to win through land-based combat and you don't have a lot of ways to buff that up, I think that would be a card that I would really look at finding a way to put into this deck.
Sounds good.
Let's look at the sorceries now, Max. What do we have for sorceries?
There are 11 sorceries. So there is a Consuming Tide. This is 2 and 2 blue. Each player chooses a non-land permanent they control and return all non-land permanents not chosen this way to their owner's hands. Then you draw a card for each opponent who has more cards in their hand than you. There's a Crush of Tentacles. This is 4 and 2 blue, or you can cast it for the surge cost of 3 and 2 blue. And the surge means you have had to cast another spell before it. And it says return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands, and then if Crush of Tentacles surge cost was paid, you make an 8/8 blue octopus creature token. We have Devastating Mastery. This is 2 and 4 white, or you can pay 2 and 2 white rather than the 6 mana, and if you pay the 2 and 2 white, an opponent chooses up to 2 non-land permanents they control and returns them to their hand, and then the card destroys all non-land permanents. So obviously you cast it for the cheaper cost, you help your opponents maybe save something they need, but you blow up everything else. We have a Devastation Tide. This is 3 and 2 blue, or you can cast it for the miracle cost of 1 in a blue, and it says return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. We have an Hour of Revelation, 3 and triple white. Hour of Revelation costs 3 less to cast if there are 10 or more non-land permanents on the battlefield, and you destroy all non-land permanents. We have an MDFC in Undo Inversion. This is 6 white to destroy all non-land permanents. Otherwise, you can bring it in as a tapped land that produces a white mana. We have Part the Water Veil. 4 and 2 blue. You take an extra turn after this and exile Part the Water Veil. You can also cast it for the Awaken cost, 6 and triple blue. And if you do, then you put 6+1/+1 counters on target land, and it becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with haste, and it's still a land. Planar Outburst is 3 and 2 white. You destroy all non-land creatures, and it can also be cast for Awaken. It has Awaken 4, so 5 and triple white. If you cast it that way, you put 4 counters on a land. We have a Ponder. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order, or you may shuffle your library and then draw a card. We have our second MDFC in Seagate Restoration. 4 triple blue. Draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand +1, and you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. The backside is a tapped blue mana source. And finally, we have Tragic Arrogance. 3 white. For each player, choose from among the permanents that player controls an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a Planeswalker, then each player sacrifices all other non-land permanents he or she controls.
All right.
Hoofda.
Yeah. The Awaken cards really make sense in this deck.
Yes.
I think outside of this style of deck, it's a really underwhelming mechanic, which isn't a problem. Every mechanic doesn't need to work in every single deck or even most decks. But in this particular deck, where you are doing things with lands, having that option to, specifically do a thing like that, putting counters on your lands is really cool. So yeah, this is a situation where there's multiple different ways this deck is running cards that you just don't see anywhere else. And a lot of those Awaken cards are an example of that. So what did you have for suggestions, Max? Anything that jumped out at you that you didn't like, that you liked, that you would change, whatever?
Overall, I think this deck just needs a little more consistent draw in it.
Sure.
There's some draw in the instance. There's a Rhystic Study. There's some creatures in here that helps draw cards. There's a Planeswalker, but I feel like there's not the stuff that normally maybe you and I play, Dana, like a Charter Course or stuff like that. So I kind of went the route of, proliferating. So I think putting something in here like Contentious Plan, which is 1 in a blue, proliferate, and then draw a card. Early game, if you don't have a land that's animated, who cares? You get to draw the card.
Right.
If you do have Noyan out, you're going to stack the triggers so the land gets animated, then you proliferate. It's going to be worthwhile. And then the other one I would suggest would be Tezzeret's Gambit. Draw 2, then proliferate, and it has Phyrexian mana in its cost, so it doesn't even cost all the mana. You can pay some life for it. I kind of like that over something like Ponder. Ponder's a cool card, but it doesn't get you anywhere. You get to reorder some cards. If you don't like them, you shuffle, and then you draw.
Yeah.
I think if you had a multiple Ponder-esque effects, maybe it'd be better, but we only really have 1 or 2 in the entire deck, maybe 3. I think I'd rather just have that consistent, I know I'm drawing 1 or 2 every time I cast a card.
Agreed. I think if this was a deck that played a little bit more like my Talran deck or something, where I have a ton of 1 and 2 mana cantrip style cards, and I'm very frequently able to cast 4 of them, that will be different. You're like, oh, so this deck is going to run a bunch of these little cantrips, and Noyan Dar is going to, trigger multiple times per turn to put things onto a creature, then that makes sense. If you're not doing that, then I feel like why not run something with a little extra gas? Maybe that's Contentious Plan, where it costs 1 more mana, but you're still drawing 1 and you're putting a counter on a creature, or Tezzeret's Gambit, or maybe it's just a Charter Course or something, or just any draw spell that's going to draw you more cards. But I feel like Ponder, unless you care about casting a bunch of spells efficiently, or you're playing a combo deck where you're trying to dig down and find a certain piece, which this deck isn't. I think there's better choices than Ponder. Ponder is a great card, might be even better than Brainstorm and Commander, but I think you have to be playing a deck that can take advantage of Ponder, and I don't know if this one is.
Yeah, I have one more suggestion that I didn't write down. So Andy did mention that, this is a control deck, and it's hard to win even through combat in this type of deck, and I totally get that. I struggle with the same things with my Brago deck. I don't want to be this guy, but putting something in like a Approach of the Second Sun. Yeah.
Backup plan later if the game goes long.
Exactly. It's a win con in case the game goes long. Like I said, there isn't a lot of... There is draw in this deck, there's not a lot, so I don't see this being like you cast it and you draw 7 cards right away. So you're giving your opponents, a couple turns to win. But I just think it's a good ripcord in case combat isn't working out. You have another way to win the game, and sometimes the games just have to end. Yeah,
totally fair. Okay, let's jump over and take a look at the creature suite here real quick.
Do we want to do instants, or are we saving those for last?
I'll save those for last, because there's a ton of them. That's that's the equivalent of creatures, I think, in this.
Just want to make
sure. A lot of people's decks. Archmage Emeritus, whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, draw a card. So it's just a draw engine, because there's, 36 instants and sorceries in this deck. Baral, Chief of Compliance, instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less. And whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may draw a card. And if you do, discard a card. So kind of a cost reducer primarily, because there's not a ton of counter spells in this deck. Cataclysmic Gear Hulk, 5 mana. It's a Vigilant 4/5. Whenever it ETBs, each player chooses an artifact, creature, or enchantment, and a planeswalker from among the non-land permanents they control and sacrifices the rest. So again, this is going to hurt other folks more than it hurts you, because you're winning via lands that attack. A Drum Bellower. Untap all creatures you control during each other player's untap step. Halimar Tidecaller. When it ETBs, you may return target card with Awaken from your graveyard to your hand, and it gives land creatures you control flying. Hullbreaker Horror, just a great piece of utility in almost any deck. It's a 7/8 with Flash for 7 mana. It can't be countered, and whenever you cast a spell, choose up to one of the following 2 options. Return a spell you don't control to its owner's hand, and return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So it's just a control piece, basically. Liar, Disciple of the Drowned for 5 mana. It's a 3/4. Spells can't be countered, and each instant or sorcery card in your graveyard has flashback, and the flashback cost is equal to the card's mana cost. Monetary Mentor, 2 and a white. It has prowess, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess onto the battlefield. Murmuring Mystic, whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, create a 1/1 blue bird creature token with flying. And last, Tomic Distinguished Advocist, 2/3 for 2 mana with flying, and lands on the battlefield and land cards in graveyards can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control, and your opponents can't play lands from graveyards, so it's going to shut off any kind of Crucible of World shenanigans and makes your lands functionally hexproof. 10 creatures here. Any ones that you like or particularly dislike, Max, or don't know why they're here?
I think this is very similar to the enchantments. I understand why they are all here, and I think they are pretty much spot on. I don't think I would really change anything. I would add something, though. I would probably add something like, again, with the proliferate kind of theme here. And I'll explain all this in the next section. But a Flux Channeler would be cool, because you're already casting a bunch of non-creature spells, proliferating that 1 land every time you cast something like, a Ponder or, an Anticipate. You're just going to pump that even more.
Yeah. The one I wasn't 100% sure about was Monastery Mentor. So the thought process there, I'm sure, is because you're casting so many non-creature spells, instants and sorceries primarily, you might as well get a free body as a blocker, and the body has prowess, so like it can wind up, the next turn being a 2/2 or a 3/3 or something, and gives you a backup plan to swing in, gives you blockers, whatever. The only thing I was wondering is if you wouldn't be better off just using Talrand in that slot for 1 more mana, because it makes flyers. If you want a thing that's going to make you bodies, yes, there are 2/2 Drakes versus 1/1 monks that have prowess, but you need to cast at least 1 spell to make those monks into the same power and toughness as the Drakes are. They're not nearly as good at blockers because they don't have flying. And that prowess trigger only works, on the turn that you're casting those spells. It goes away again the next turn. So yes, occasionally you're going to have 6 of those tokens out and you're going to be able to cast 3 spells and make them into 3/3s and kill somebody. I would say equally often you're going to have 6 Drakes out, and that's still going to be 12 damage. You can kill somebody with a 2, and they're much better blockers. So I'm torn. 6 and 1, half dozen on the other. I have a feeling for the utility that this deck is using Monastery Mentor for. You would rather have Drakes. It would be different if there was maybe a Skull Clamp in the deck, and I was like, oh, you're using it for Skull Clamp fodder or something, along with the Murmuring Mystic tokens. But that isn't in here. I'm guessing it's primarily being used defensively. It's a way to get around the overburden and just get free value out of spells you're already casting. And I think the utility from Talrand Drakes is better than a Monastery Mentor monks. So I'm torn, but that would be something I would at least consider. I also don't know if Baral is that good. So it's a cost reduction. Instant or sorcery spells cost 1 less. There are 36 instant or sorceries here. And aside from Ponder, Brainstorm, Clock Spinning, Mystical Tutor, Swan Song, and Swords to Plowshares, they all have a colorless mana in the mana cost. So it is, of those 36, it is going to reduce the mana cost on your spells by 1 on 30 of them. But there's only 6 counter spells in the deck. So you're only going to draw a free card on 6 of those spells, and it's not even a draw, it's just a filter, because you have to discard a card too. So I'm not sure about Baral. What do you think?
I actually think it's great in this deck because the draw ability doesn't just count spells, it counts abilities.
Sure, so
Equinox and any of those enchantments will trigger it. So I think it's worth keeping in the deck. I'm sure Andy's tested enough to where he can defend it more than we can, by just hypothesizing here, but I think because it also hits effects like abilities of other cards, it's worth it.
Could be. Okay. Yeah, I would totally buy that. That was the other one. And the last one I was a little bit unsure about was Drumbellor. Untap all creatures you control during other players' untap steps. If you have a commander that has an activated ability or something, makes sense. If you've got a bunch of creatures, it makes sense. I don't think it's never going to be bad. It's a 3-mana 2/1 that has evasion and untaps your creatures, kind of giving them pseudo vigilance. That's very solid. I just don't know if it's better than like something else that you could run in that slot. I'm wondering if it's not being used here to let you untap those lands and then use the mana that they would produce to cast an instant or sorcery spell. So like I'm going to swing at somebody with this creature land, and then, I've got 2 lands left, and I'll pass a turn, and then I will untap that creature and use 1 and 1 to cast, a clock spinning. And then like on the next turn I'll untap that creature again and use it to cast a mystical tutor, and untap the creature again and use it to cast, a swan song if I need to or something. I'm wondering if that isn't the use of it. And I can see in the right situation when you have a land and you have a bunch of instant spells in hand, that would be useful. I could also see that that's like kind of a magical Christmas land a little bit too. So I'm curious about how frequently that works with Drumbellow.
Yeah, it's a flyer, but you're not pumping this.
Right.
I think you might almost be better just running something like Brave the Sands, which gives all your creatures vigilance. So since you're not going wide, like I'd get Drumbeller if this was like a go wide Noyan Dar deck where you're animating multiple lands and swinging. But since we're going tall, we're only really concerned about that 1, maybe 2 lands untapping. At that point, Brave the Sands is 1 and a white, gives all your creatures vigilance, and they can block a second creature. So, like, if you have that 9/9 indestructible Darksteel Citadel, double block. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it's a little cheaper mana-wise. It probably does more overall, and it's harder to remove. I would go Brave the Sands over something like Drumbeller.
Right, yeah, that's the thing about Drumbell, right? I think it gives you it gives good utility, but I wonder if the utility combined with how fragile it is, I'm not sold on it completely. I can see how it's useful. I just like wondering, would something else that we talked, like I feel like given a choice between having Drumbeller in the deck and having Duelist Heritage in the deck, Duelist Heritage is going to win you a lot more games, or at least like make really impactful plays more than Drumbeller will at the same exact mana cost.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's not a matter of whether or not it's good, it's a matter of whether or not it's good enough for this particular deck that's clearly been like pretty tuned over the years.
Yeah.
There's one Planeswalker here we'll quick talk about before we move on to the instance. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, 5 mana for the 4 loyalty. Teferi, +1 abilities, draw a card, and at the beginning of the next end step, untap 2 lands. So pseudo vigilance with your creatures. I mean, that's a useful ability just in general, let alone in a deck where your lands are also creatures. The -3, put target non-land permanent into its owner's library, third from the top, and the -8, you get an emblem with whenever you draw a card, exile target permanent and opponent controls. People are going to not let you get to that point for the most part. So it's a Planeswalker that draws you a card and lets you untap your lands. That's pretty great. Nothing to say about that. I get why it's here, and I will leave it in the deck.
Yep, so good. So good.
Yeah. Max, let's throw back to you. What do we have here for the
instance?
The instance,
Okay, there are 25 instants. We have an Anticipate, an Arcane Denial, a Brainstorm, which I'm sure Dana will talk about later. We have a Capsize, Clock Spinning, Cyclonic Rift, Dig Through Time, Encircling Fissure. This was unique to me, so this is 2 and a white, and it prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn by creatures target opponent controls, and you can awaken it for 4 and a white to put 2+1/+1 counters on a land. There's a Fact or Fiction, Frantic Search, draw 2, discard 2, untap 3 lands. Up to 3 lands. That's probably important sometimes. We have an Impulse, look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 1 in your hand and the rest on the bottom, in any order. Mystical Tutor, a Render Silent, Rewind, Scatter to the Winds, the counter spell that has Awaken 3, Sajiri Shelter, the final MDFC, target creature you control gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn for 1 and a white, otherwise it enters as a tapped mana source that produces white. We have a Swan Song, we have the Swords to Plowshares, the cool Japanese mystical archive card. We have a Teferi's Protection. We have Teferi's Response. This is 1 in a blue, and you can counter target spell or ability an opponent controls that targets a land you control. If a permanent ability is countered this way, destroy that permanent, and you draw 2 cards.
Okay.
Think Twice. Just 2 mana, draw a card, and you can flash it back. We have 2 arms. It's 1 in a white. You untap all creatures you control and draw a card. Unwind, just another counterspell that lets you untap lands. Vanish into Memory. This is 2 white and a blue. You exile target creature. You draw cards equal to that creature's power, and then at the beginning of the next upkeep, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. If you do, discard cards equal to that creature's toughness. Man, that's really great when you have a 10/10 land that's going to come back as a 0/0. And then View from Above is the final instant. It's 1 in a blue. Target creature gains flying until end of turn. If you control a white permanent, return View from Above to its owner's hand. So a cool little reusable spell.
Yeah, a lot of good cards here. I don't have a ton of suggestions. I will touch on Vanish into Memory briefly because it's a card I'm kind of a fan of. It's never bad. Even if all you do is like stop an Alpha Strike, like someone swinging at you with, their 6/6 that's got double strike or whatever it is, or like something you can do, you're just like, I don't want to get hit by that. It's too much damage. Vanish into Memory, and you're going to draw 6 cards, and then when it comes back into play, you'll discard 6. But like filtering down 6 is still not terrible. You're technically down a card because you cast Vanish, but like getting to C6, pitch the things you don't need, maybe keep something that's really important while not taking damage is pretty useful. And that's the worst case scenario. You mentioned in this deck, hey, you might have a land that's a 10/10 and you're going to draw 10 cards. In a perfect world, move those counters onto the Ozolith. And then the land comes back into play. You don't have to discard anything, and the counters are still there to be put back onto a land. I mean, there's a ton of upside here, let alone living the absolute eternal dream where someone makes a Merit Lage token and you zap the Marriage Wade token, draw 20, they lose their creature, and it doesn't come back because it's a token. So I love Vanish to Memory. This is a perfect deck for it, and I'm glad to see it show up here. Other than that, again, I think this felt like the area where I had the least to offer. If you needed a little more draw or removal of this deck, there's a few things you can maybe sacrifice, but I don't know none of these are bad cards at all. They make perfect sense in this deck. I just don't know what I would really change here. Is there anything specifically that you would get rid of, Max?
So I have a couple cards.
Okay.
I'm not a big fan of Render Silent. I was back in the day.
Yep.
I just think it's the cost heavy, 2 blue and a white. And over time, I have found that its controller can't cast spells this turn clause started to not help in a multiplayer format.
Yes.
Because you have, I'll stop your Swords to Plowshares, but then the guy to your right's gonna be like, well, I'll use mine if it means, I can keep you in the game, and now there's politics involved and you're still losing your creature. I would rather just run like a hard counterspell itself, Fierce Guardianship.
An offer you can't refuse that only costs single blue.
There you go. So that's my first one I have, mixed feelings on. But the big one in here for me is Clock Spinning.
Okay.
So Clock Spinning is a single blue, and it has buyback for 3 generic mana, and it says choose a counter on target permanent or suspended card, remove that counter, or put an additional counter on it. For 4 mana, that seems like a lot to proliferate.
Yes.
So that's kind of, in my mind, where I went with adding more of these proliferation cards, because Karn's Bastion alone is 4 mana to proliferate, and it's any mana. So why not just run that land instead of Clock Spinning? Or run Tezzeret's Gambit over this, or Flux Channeler.
The Flux Channeler is one that jumps out at me. I think I would much rather have a Flux Channeler in this deck than I would Clock Spinning.
So that is kind of where I went with maybe more proliferation might do well in this, and maybe Andy had that iteration of this deck, and he'll explain to us why he doesn't run those cards anymore. Otherwise, there's not a lot of removal here in the sense of like the Generous Gifts, your Pongifies, that type of stuff. But maybe that's just not what this deck wants to do, and it just wants to play the counter spells and the abilities to protect the lands.
Yeah, I do actually quite like View from Above here.
Yes.
Instant speed for 2 mana, 1 in a blue. Target creature gains flying till end of turn, and if you control a white permanent, return View from Above to its owner's hand. What's particularly nice about that is it just lets you. It's a way. It's like a free buyback almost. So it's 2 mana to give your land evasion, which is useful in and of itself. And if you have the ability to, cast it multiple times in a turn because you have mana, then you can just keep triggering that Noyan Dar ability. And I'm assuming that's like what Clock Spinning is trying to do, but Clock Spinning is going to cost you 4 every time you do that versus 2 for View from Above. And I feel like the View from Above one is going to be way easier to abuse than Clock Spinning is.
Right.
So Yeah, great card. Glad to see it here. I again, think twice is way to get. It's drawing you a card for 2 mana and it has flashback for 3, but it's 2 cast triggers. So like you're able to cast it and cast it again to get the double casts off of Noyan. So it's a way to get multiple triggers as well. There's a lot of those interesting cards here that do things like that have a little bit of extra gas in them. Yeah, it's. The whole deck is pretty tight, and we're mostly just talking about useful cards here versus like offering suggestions because there's just not that many things to suggest in a deck that he's clearly been working on for a long time.
Yeah, this deck is awesome. I've seen it played on stream. You've played against it in person. This was a lot of fun to go over.
Absolutely. Well, hey, Andy, thank you for number 1, supporting the show. Number 2, for sharing the deck with us. Number 3, for actually getting out there and making your own excellent content. And for just being a good dude that I've gotten to hang out with, and you've had us on your stream, and you're just an all-around positive member of the community. So thanks for all of those things. Thanks to all of you for listening and being with us for 5 years. We really do appreciate it.
Woohoo!
5 years, man. That's crazy.
Super crazy.
That is going to wrap up this episode of Commander Central. I am Dana. You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited by Rafael Garcia, and you can find them on the Twitter boards at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We'll be back on Thursday with another deck tech. Until then, I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.